Good evening all, and welcome back to Eerie Hour. Tonight, I bring you 8 deeply unsettling accounts from the wide and lonely lands of Alberta, where the prairies seem to stretch forever and the shadows of the mountains hide more than just animals. In this episode, we will travel through some of the most disturbing true crime stories that have come out of this quiet-looking Canadian province. Stories whispered in small towns, tucked away in old case files, and carried by the people who survived things they still cannot fully understand. These are tales of disappearances that make no sense, of groups that twisted belief into control, of people who hunted in plain sight, and of crimes so strange they seem to cross the line between the natural world and something far darker. Every story you hear tonight has been researched carefully and comes from real events, real investigations, and real voices of people who lived through the unthinkable. For the safety of survivors and the families of victims, some names and details have been changed, but the truth behind each account remains just as disturbing as when it first happened. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Eerie Hour for daily true crime and horror stories that will stay in your thoughts long after the video ends. Tap the notification bell so you never miss when another piece of prairie darkness reaches out to tell its secrets. Now, let us begin with a story that starts in one of the most beautiful places in Alberta and ends with a mystery that has never been solved. I have always found comfort in the mountains. There is something about the way they stand so old and silent against the sky that makes you feel small in a peaceful way. Like your problems shrink when you are standing in front of something that existed long before you and will exist long after. I grew up in Calgary with my younger brother Nathan. Every summer, our family drove out to the Rockies to hike and camp and breathe the cold, clean air that always tasted like pine and snow, even in the hottest weeks. Nathan loved those trips more than anyone. He spent every drive with his face pressed to the window, watching the flat prairies rise into rolling foothills and then into sharp, massive mountains that looked like they were holding up the sky. When Nathan turned 23, he had just finished his environmental science degree, and he wanted to celebrate with a solo backpacking trip through Banff National Park. He had planned it for months, marking trails on maps, picking campsites, and reading every guidebook he could find about the area. I remember sitting at our parents' kitchen table while he spread out his maps and showed me the route he wanted to take. He was so excited that his hands shook a little as he traced the lines with his finger. Marine Lake would be his base camp. He planned to stay there 3 nights and do day hikes to nearby peaks. I told him it sounded incredible. I told him to be careful. I told him to text me every night so I knew he was safe. That was in August 2019, and the weather that week was perfect. Clear skies, warm days, and cool nights. Nathan left on a Thursday morning and sent me a picture from the trailhead around 10 a.m. He was smiling the way he did when he was truly happy. Wearing his blue backpack and those old hiking boots he refused to replace even though the soles were basically falling apart. His next message came that evening around 7. He had reached Marine Lake and set up his tent. He sent a picture of the sunset over the water, so blue and bright it almost looked fake, like someone boosted the colors even though he swore it really looked that way. He said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He said he felt like he was the only person in the world. I told him I was jealous and to stay safe. He replied with a thumbs up emoji. That was the last normal message I ever got from him. Friday around noon, he texted again to say he was hiking up to Sentinel Pass and would check in later. I texted back to have fun. Then around 3 p.m., another message came. This one was strange. It said, "Evelyn, did you know there are other trails here that are not on the map?" He didn't ask it like a question, more like he had already decided it was true. I wrote back asking what he meant. No response. I tried not to worry. Cell service in the mountains is terrible, and I thought his signal had dropped. But when 9 p.m. passed with no message, I started calling. Every call went straight to voicemail. I told myself he was fine, that his phone battery died, that he was probably already asleep in his tent, and that I would hear from him in the morning. I barely slept. I kept checking my phone, nothing. By Saturday afternoon, I couldn't stay calm anymore. I called Parks Canada and told them my brother was hiking alone near Marine Lake and hadn't contacted me in over 24 hours. They said they would send rangers to check the campsites. I gave them every detail: his planned route, his campsite number, what he was wearing. Then I called my parents. My mom cried instantly. My dad said he was getting in the car right then. The rangers found Nathan's tent Saturday evening. It was still at his registered campsite right by the lake. The tent was zipped closed from the outside. Inside, everything was neat. His sleeping bag rolled up, his camp stove beside it, his food bag hanging safely from a tree, his hiking boots placed side by side just inside the tent. It looked like he came back from a hike, took off his boots, and stepped out again for something quick. But he never returned. His wallet was there, his car keys were there, his water bottle was there. Only Nathan and his phone were missing. A full search began Sunday morning. Volunteers combed the trails. Search dogs sniffed every path. Helicopters scanned from above. My parents and I drove out to Lake Louise and waited for updates. The rangers told us Marine Lake was a popular area. If Nathan had gotten hurt on a main trail, someone would have found him. But they kept searching anyway. On Monday afternoon, 3 days after Nathan's last message, a hiker found his phone. It was lying face down in the dirt on a trail that went away from Marine Lake, in the opposite direction of Sentinel Pass. The screen was cracked but still working. The battery was dead. Rangers brought it back, charged it, and called me. They asked if I knew his passcode. I did. We had always shared them for emergencies. I gave it to them and waited. 20 minutes later, a ranger called back. His voice was strange, slow, careful. He said they found something on the phone that I needed to hear. He told me to sit down. I sat on the hotel bed, gripping my phone so tightly my hands hurt. He said there was a voice memo recorded at 2:17 p.m. on Friday, about an hour before Nathan sent that odd text about unmapped trails. He asked if I wanted him to play it. I said yes. The recording began with rustling, like the phone being pulled out of a pocket, then heavy breathing, as if Nathan had been walking fast or running. Then his voice, quiet, shaky, unlike anything I had ever heard from him. He said, "I am on a trail that is not on any of my maps. I've been following it for about 20 minutes. There are markers, cairns made of stacked rocks, but they're old, really old, covered in lichen. I haven't seen anyone, but I keep hearing footsteps behind me. Every time I turn, there's nobody. I can hear them. Someone is walking exactly in rhythm with my steps, and the trees here, they're wrong. They're all dead but still standing, rows and rows of them on both sides, and they have marks carved into them, symbols I don't know." He said he would keep recording while he walked. For almost a minute, only footsteps and his fast breathing filled the audio. Then, in a whisper, he said, "Evelyn, if you're listening, if something happens to me, you need to know they are not what they look like. I thought they were hikers. I thought I was catching up to people on the trail, but when I got closer, their clothes are wrong, old clothes, like 100 years old, and they don't move right. Their legs bend the wrong way. There are 5 of them. They keep looking back, and their faces," his voice shook, "their faces are wrong, Evelyn. Their mouths are too wide. I'm turning back. I'm going back to camp. I'm leaving tomorrow morning." The recording ended. I sat there, holding the silent phone to my ear long after it stopped. The ranger asked if I was still there. I asked if they had searched the trail Nathan described. He said they searched every trail within 10 miles of Marine Lake. There was nothing like what Nathan described. No dead forests marked with symbols, no ancient cairns, no hidden path. I told him that made no sense. Nathan wouldn't imagine that. He had clearly been somewhere real. The ranger spoke quietly. He said he believed me. They would keep searching. They searched 2 more weeks. They never found Nathan. Never found any sign of where he went after he left his phone on that strange trail. The case is still open. Officially, he is a missing person, presumed dead from exposure or an accident in the wilderness. But I know what I heard in that recording. I know the sound of my brother terrified, and I know he saw something in those mountains, something he wasn't meant to see. 1 year after Nathan disappeared, I went back to Marine Lake. I didn't know what I hoped to find. Maybe closure, maybe a sign he was still out there in some way. I hiked the same trails, searched for strange cairns, dead trees, anything that matched his words. I found nothing. But on the last day, while standing at the edge of the lake watching the sunset turn the water that impossible shade of blue, I heard footsteps behind me, crunching on gravel, matching my breathing, getting closer. I turned. No one was there, but I could still hear the steps, still hear someone walking toward me even though I stood completely alone. And then, whistling, a tune I knew instantly. Nathan used to whistle it all the time when we were kids. An old folk song our grandmother taught us. The whistling came from the tree line, from somewhere deep in the dark shapes between the pines. I called Nathan's name, the whistling stopped, the footsteps stopped. The mountains fell into that strange, heavy silence where even the wind seems to freeze. I left Marine Lake that evening, and I have not returned. But every year, on the anniversary of Nathan's disappearance, I receive a text from his phone number, the number that was shut off years ago, the phone that is locked away in an evidence box in a Parks Canada office. The text always says the same thing. It just repeats that they are still here. I've tried replying. I've tried calling back. Nothing ever connects, but the messages don't stop. The rangers keep telling me it's some kind of technical glitch, some random leftover signal bouncing around the towers. They say it isn't really Nathan, but I know my brother's voice, and I don't think it's an error. I think he's trying to warn me. I think he found something in those mountains that humans were never supposed to discover. Something that has been there far longer than our trails, longer than any map, longer than the parks we built over the land. Something old that waits in the empty spaces we never charted. I still have that recording saved on my phone. Sometimes late at night, I listen to it again, hoping to hear something I missed before, some little clue about where he went or what he saw. And each time, something new stands out. Under Nathan's voice, buried deep in the static, there's another sound. It's faint, but once you notice it, you can't forget it. It sounds like laughter, but not human. It's older, colder, and has nothing warm in it. If you ever hike near the alpine lakes, stay exactly on the marked paths. Don't follow cairns that look too old. Don't trust paths that appear out of nowhere. And if you hear steps behind you when nobody is around, don't turn back. Just walk faster. Head toward people, toward lights, toward witnesses. Because there are things in those mountains that never want to be seen. And my brother made the mistake of seeing them. Anyway, I've worked in government jobs most of my life, and I can tell you the scariest things aren't dramatic. They're not the cases that end up on TV. The real horror hides in tiny mistakes, files that don't line up, evidence that shouldn't exist but does. I learned this in the winter of 2023 when I was working as an inventory clerk for the Edmonton Police Evidence Storage Facility. The work wasn't exciting. Most days I was in a cold warehouse scanning barcodes, shelving boxes, and checking old cases. Cold cases, solved cases, forgotten cases. Thousands of boxes filled with pieces of someone's worst day. My supervisor, Harris, had been there almost 30 years. He always said nothing surprised him anymore. The job was simple if you followed the system. Every item had a number. Every number had a file. Every file listed exactly what belonged in each box. The system worked perfectly, unless someone messed up, a wrong label, a misplaced box, and something could vanish for years. In January, I was assigned to audit Section C, which held evidence from the 1980s. Mostly drug cases, some assaults, a few break-ins. Nothing unusual. I was in my third week when I found a box with the wrong label. The number said 874,429, a case that should have held clothing from a convenience store robbery. But the box felt too light. I opened it. Inside was just a single VHS tape in a clear evidence bag. The label on the tape, written in faded blue ink, said, "Griffin Confession, December 12, 1987. That was it. No other notes. I checked the database again. No mention of a tape. I checked the physical file. No Griffin, no confession, nothing. I brought it to Harris. He stared at it a long time, then said to log it as a mislabeled item and he'd handle it. I asked if we should watch it to figure out what case it belonged to. He said no, that wasn't our job, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I always notice things that don't fit. So that night after my shift, I told Harris I wanted to stay late to finish the section. He agreed. I waited until he drove away. Then I went back to the box. We had an old VCR in the break room for converting old tapes. My hands shook as I slid the tape in. The video was grainy and washed out like old VHS always looks. The timestamp said December 12, 1987, 3:47 p.m. The camera pointed at a metal chair inside what looked like a barn or shed. Concrete floor, wooden walls, one dim light overhead. After 30 seconds, a man walked in and sat down. Maybe 40 years old, thin, plaid shirt, jeans, greasy dark hair. He stared at the camera and smiled. A wrong-looking smile. He said, "My name is Adam Griffin, and I'm making this confession of my own free will. Nobody is forcing me. I want people to know what I did." His voice was flat and strange, like he was repeating something he had memorized. He folded his hands and continued. He said that on October 3, 1987, he murdered a woman named Zoe Harper, age 26. Picked her up outside a bar in Leduc around 11:30 p.m. She thought he was giving her a ride home. He took her to a barn on his property on Rural Route 2, Range Road 2, 141, 15 kilometers south of Leduc. He said he strangled her with a rope, that it took 4 minutes for her to stop breathing. Then he buried her in the northwest corner of the property, 60 meters from the barn, 3 feet deep, marked by a pile of stones. Then he stopped talking and stared at the camera for almost a minute. Finally, he said he wanted her family to know where she was so they could bury her properly. Then he stood up and walked away. The tape kept rolling on the empty chair for another 2 minutes before turning to static. I felt sick. I rewound it and watched again. The details were too specific to be fake. Why wasn't this in any file? I searched the database for any case involving a Zoe Harper in 1987. Nothing. I searched for Adam Griffin. Nothing. I searched all Leduc cases from 1987. Nothing. I called Harris even though it was almost 10. He answered, irritated. I told him everything. What was on the tape, that there was a body somewhere south of Leduc. He stayed silent for a long time, then asked if I had watched the tape. I said yes. He reminded me that he told me not to. I said I knew, but this was important. He sighed and said he'd come back. 20 minutes later, he arrived. I showed him the tape. He watched without speaking. When it ended, he said we had to call the cold case unit. 2 detectives arrived within an hour. They took the tape, the box, everything. 3 days later, 1 detective called. They went to the exact location mentioned, Rural Route 2, Range Road 2, 141, northwest corner. They dug 4 feet down with radar. They found nothing, no body, no bones, no disturbed soil. I asked if they were sure about the spot. He said yes, they checked several times. The property existed, but nothing was buried there. Then I asked about Zoe Harper. He said they checked every missing person record from the 1980s. No Zoe Harper. No unsolved case matching her. No woman strangled and buried south of Leduc. I told him it made no sense. He agreed. It was very strange. Then he asked if I had any more info about Adam Griffin. I said just what he said on the tape. He was quiet. Then he told me they did find an Adam Griffin who lived in that area, but he had died in a car accident in June 1985, 2.5 years before the date of the confession. My stomach dropped. I said maybe it was a different Adam Griffin. He said there wasn't another one. They had the death certificate, the accident report, everything. Griffin died instantly when he crashed into a concrete barrier while drunk. So how could a dead man confess in 1987? The detective didn't know. They sent the tape to a lab to check for editing. 2 weeks later, I came into work and went to get the box because the detectives had said they were returning the tape after tests. The box was there, right where I left it, but the evidence bag was empty. The tape was gone. Nobody had signed it out. Harris said he hadn't moved it. The detective said they returned it 4 days earlier. He came back with his partner and we searched everything. The tape was nowhere. It had simply vanished. He asked if I made any copies. I said no. He asked if I was absolutely sure about what I saw. I said yes. I watched it 3 times. He wrote it down, but I could tell he didn't really believe me anymore. That was 8 months ago. I still work at the warehouse. I still handle cold cases. But now, late at night when I'm alone, I think about Adam Griffin sitting in that chair, confessing to a murder that never happened, 2 years after he died. I think about Zoe Harper, who doesn't exist anywhere, who was never reported missing, who isn't buried anywhere. And sometimes I dream about that barn. In the dream, I'm the one in the chair and the camera is filming me. And when I speak, it's not my voice, it's Griffin's. And I'm admitting to things I've never done, crimes from places that don't exist. I wake up with my throat burning like I've been talking for hours. Last week, I found dirt under my nails even though I hadn't been outside. The dirt was dark and smelled rotten. I washed my hands over and over, but I could still smell it. I think something came back with me from that tape. I think watching it opened a door that was supposed to stay shut, and now I can't close it. My name is Audrey, and before I tell you this story, you need to understand something. When you're a child, you don't know what normal is. You only know what adults teach you. You only know the world they build around you. So when I grew up in the Helping Hands commune outside Lethbridge in the 1990s, I didn't know any of it was wrong. I thought it was normal. I thought it was what God wanted. I thought I was being saved. The commune was founded in 1989 by a man who called himself Patrick, though I later learned that wasn't his real name. He bought a huge property outside Lethbridge, flat land, a main house, some outbuildings, and a big barn he turned into a chapel. He called it Helping Hands because he said we were the hands of God building a new world. He preached that the outside world was full of sin, that cities were crawling with demons, and the only way to stay pure was to cut ourselves off completely. People believed him. Families believed him. My parents joined when I was 7 in 1994. They were struggling. My dad had lost his job. My mom was working double shifts, and we were losing our house. Then they met Patrick at a church event. He told them money didn't matter, that God would provide for the faithful, that they could live at Helping Hands and be part of a community that cared for its own. My parents were desperate. They sold everything and moved us there. Around 30 people lived there when we arrived. Families, kids, older people who gave Patrick their savings. Everyone lived in the main house or tiny cabins scattered around. The men tended the land. The women cooked and cleaned. The kids were watched constantly. And Patrick prayed with us 3 times a day without fail. At first, it felt peaceful. There was always food. I had other kids to play with. My parents smiled more, but then the rules appeared. We couldn't leave the property without permission. We couldn't talk to outsiders. No TV, no radio. Patrick said they poisoned our minds. We had to ask permission for almost everything. And if someone broke the rules, Patrick said they needed purification. He claimed sin lived inside us like a sickness, and we needed to be cleansed to be worthy of God. For adults, it meant fasting or kneeling for hours. For children, it was worse. He said kids were full of sin because we didn't know how to control ourselves. We needed discipline. When I was 8, I was caught playing with a toy I had hidden, a small stuffed rabbit I had since I was a baby. Toys were forbidden. Patrick said they distracted from God. When he found it, he took it from me and said I needed purification. He brought me to the barn, to a back room he called the prayer chamber. Inside was a wooden box the size of a short coffin with air holes. He told me to get in. He said I needed to think about my sins. I was in that box for 6 hours. It was pitch dark. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. I screamed and cried, but nobody came. When he finally opened it, he asked if I understood why I was punished. I said yes. I said I was sorry. I said I would never disobey again. He smiled and told me God was proud. That was the first time, but not the last. Over the next 6 years, I was put in that prayer box dozens of times for talking back, for not finishing chores, for questioning him, for crying when I was supposed to be praying. Other children were punished the same way. Some were locked inside that box for days at a time. We learned not to cry. We learned not to complain. We learned that any kind of resistance only made everything worse. But the prayer boxes were not the worst thing. The worst part was the confessions. Every Sunday night, Patrick gathered all of us inside the chapel and forced us to confess our sins in front of everyone. He said sin could not stay hidden, that it had to be dragged into the light so it could be destroyed. He would walk slowly around the room, pointing at each child, demanding we confess. And if anyone said they had not sinned, he told them they were lying. He told us that everyone sins, and that the only sin bigger than sinning was pretending we hadn't done anything wrong. So we learned to make stories up. We learned to confess to things we had never done just so he would leave us alone. I confessed to stealing food I never touched. I confessed to having thoughts I had never had. I confessed to hating my parents even though I loved them deeply. And after every confession, Patrick made us kneel while he placed his hands on our heads and prayed for our souls. His hands always felt too heavy, like he was pressing down with all his strength, trying to crush us into the floor. When I was 14 years old, a social worker named Penelope came to the commune. Someone had filed a complaint. I never found out who. She interviewed several of us, including me. She asked if we were happy. She asked if we felt safe. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her about the prayer boxes and the confessions and the way Patrick stared at us like we were broken things he needed to fix. But terror wrapped around me. Patrick had told us that if we ever told outsiders what happened at Helping Hands, God would punish us. He said we would go to hell. He said our families would be damned as well. So when Penelope asked me if everything was okay, I looked straight into her eyes and lied. I said yes. I said I was happy. I said I loved living there. But Penelope did not believe me. She must have seen something in my face or heard something in my voice, because 2 weeks later, she returned with police officers and a court order. They removed 12 children from the commune, including me. They took us to foster homes. They told us we were safe now. They told us we would not have to go back. My parents stayed behind. They believed in Patrick even after all of it. They believed he was innocent, that the government was targeting him for his faith. They cut all contact with me. I have not spoken to them in over 20 years. Patrick was never charged with anything. The investigation went on for months, but there was not enough evidence. The children who spoke up, including me, were too scared to go into detail. We had been trained too well to keep secrets, and even after we were free, that terror stayed inside us. And the adults at the commune protected him. They said he was a good man. They said he saved their lives. They said we children were the ones lying. In 2003, the commune shut down, the property was abandoned, Patrick vanished. Some say he moved to British Columbia and started a new group under a new name. Others say he died. No one knows for sure. I visited the property once when I was 25. I still do not know why I did it. Maybe I needed to see it again to prove to myself that it had really happened. The buildings were falling apart, windows smashed, roofs collapsing. The barn, where I had spent so many hours inside that box, was still standing, but barely. I stepped inside. The prayer chamber was still in the back, and carved into the wooden floor were symbols, circles, triangles, strange letters I did not recognize. They had not been there when I was a child, Or maybe they had, and I had simply never dared to look down. Behind the barn, I found something else. A stretch of ground that looked disturbed, as if it had been dug up and filled again. There were 12 small mounds, each one marked with a tiny pile of stones. 12 mounds, 12 children. I called the police. They came and excavated the site. They found remains, small bones. The coroner said the children had died over several years during the 1990s. The cause of death in most cases was malnutrition and dehydration. In other words, they had been starved. The deaths had all been recorded as natural causes: pneumonia, heart defects, illness. No one had questioned it. No one investigated. The children had been buried on the property without autopsies, without real funerals, without the outside world ever knowing they were gone. Patrick was never found. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but he disappeared completely. In 2018, someone reported seeing him in a small town near Prince George, but by the time police arrived, he had vanished again. He is still out there somewhere. He would be around 70 now if he is alive. And sometimes I think about him. I wonder if he still believes he was right, if he thinks he was doing God's work, if he remembers the children he killed, or if he finally convinced himself they died because they lacked faith. I still have nightmares about the prayer box. I wake up gasping, feeling like the walls are inches from my face, like the darkness is swallowing me whole. My therapist says it is trauma. She says it will get better with time, but it has been 25 years and I still cannot sleep in complete darkness. I still cannot handle small rooms. I still flinch when someone places their hand on the top of my head. There were supposed to be investigations. There were supposed to be charges against the adults who helped Patrick or turned a blind eye, but nothing ever happened. The system failed us. The church failed us. Our own parents failed us, and Patrick walked away untouched. If you ever hear of a religious group that isolates itself, that demands total obedience to one leader, that punishes children for normal behavior, please report it. Do not ignore it. Do not assume someone else will do it, because I am telling you from experience, no one does. No one saves those children unless someone finally speaks up. And when someone does, it is almost always too late. My name is Vivan and I am a journalist. Or at least I was, before I could no longer separate my work from my grief. I spent 5 years researching missing and murdered Indigenous women across Western Canada, gathering records, interviewing families, looking for patterns in cases police had shrugged off as runaways or accidents or women who simply walked away from their lives. I thought I was doing important work. I thought I was giving a voice to the forgotten. But I never expected to find my own cousin's name in the files I was building. I never expected the story to become mine. Her name was Evelyn. She was my mother's brother's daughter, 3 years younger than me, and she had a laugh so bright that other people would start laughing with her, even if they had no idea what was funny. She grew up on the Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, then moved to Grand Prairie when she was 19 to find work. She wanted to save money for college. She wanted to be a teacher. She worked at a restaurant and shared a small apartment with 2 other girls. She called my mother every Sunday to talk about her week. She was careful. She was planning her future. In July 2017, Evelyn's roommate called my aunt to say Evelyn had not come home from her shift 3 days earlier. She had been last seen leaving work around 11 at night. She told her coworkers she was heading to the gas station a few blocks away for cigarettes, and then would try to get a ride home because it was late and she didn't want to wait for the bus. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. My aunt filed a missing person report immediately. The Grand Prairie RCMP took it, but the way my aunt described their questions made my stomach turn. They asked if she had a boyfriend. They asked if she used drugs. They asked if she had any reason to run away. My aunt told them, no. Evelyn wasn't like that. Something is wrong. But I knew how these cases usually went. I had been studying them for 3 years by then. When an Indigenous woman goes missing, Everything slows down. The response is slower. The resources are fewer. The assumptions are uglier. I drove to Grand Prairie the next day. I started asking around. I talked to Evelyn's coworkers, her roommates, people who hung around the gas station, and that is when I noticed something. Evelyn was not the first woman to disappear in that area. She was the 8th in a little over 2 years. 8 women, all indigenous, all between 19 and 32, all last seen somewhere along Highway 43 between Grand Prairie and Whitecourt. 8 women, and no one was talking about it. There were no news stories, no task force, just 8 separate missing person files no one had connected. I built a timeline. The first woman vanished in March 2015. Her name was Jolene. She was 23. She had been hitchhiking from Grand Prairie to a reserve near Slave Lake. Her family reported her missing when she never arrived. Our CMP searched the highway and found nothing. 6 months later, another woman vanished, then another, and another. All of them hitchhiking or walking along Highway 43. All of them swallowed by the dark stretch of road without a trace until October 2017, when a hunter stumbled onto the first body in a dense patch of forest, about 5 kilometers off the highway near Valley View. The remains were skeletal, scattered by animals. Forensics identified her as one of the missing women from 2016. Then, over the next 3 months, they found 5 more bodies in the same area, all within a few kilometers of each other. All of them had been there for months or years. All of them were positioned the same way, lying on their backs, hands folded over their chests, their faces turned east toward the rising sun. Evelyn was the 6th body they found. I was there when they carried her out of the woods. I watched the black body bag move through the trees and get loaded into the coroner's van. My aunt collapsed. My uncle held her up. I just stood there, feeling like I was watching someone else's tragedy, like this was another case for my research, but it wasn't. It was Evelyn. It was my cousin, who used to braid my hair when we were kids. The girl who wanted to teach children. The RCMP finally admitted they were dealing with a serial killer. They formed a task force. They reviewed highway camera footage. And in January 2018, they arrested a long-haul trucker named Ellis, who had been driving the Grand Prairie to Edmonton route for 7 years. They found journals in his truck, dozens of notebooks filled with details about every woman he picked up, every conversation, and every moment of their deaths. He called them his collection. He called them angels. He said he was gathering them, chosen by God to find pure souls and release them so they could ascend. He had a method. He picked up women hitchhiking along Highway 43 at night when the road was empty. He talked to them, asking about their lives, families, beliefs. He called it a purity test. If they passed by answering in a way that matched whatever twisted rule he believed, he drove down a logging road, walked them into the forest, strangled them with his hands, then placed them facing east and prayed over them until sunrise. Ellis was convicted of 6 murders in 2019, 6 out of 8, because they never found the other 2 bodies. They searched for months, using cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. They interrogated Ellis for days, trying to make him say where he left the other 2 women. He said he couldn't remember. He said there were so many that the faces blurred that he only wrote down the women who were truly pure. The other 2, he said, must not have passed his test, so he left them in places he didn't consider sacred. Or maybe he was lying. Maybe he wanted to keep that last piece of control, to keep hurting the families who wanted answers. Ellis died in prison in 2022. Another inmate had heard about his crimes and attacked him. Ellis never woke up. He died without telling anyone where the last 2 women were buried. And one of those women is still my cousin Evelyn's friend, Sarah, who vanished 2 weeks before Evelyn. Sarah's mother still calls me sometimes, asking if I have heard anything new, if there have been more searches, if anyone is still looking. I tell her no. I tell her the case is closed, that Ellis is dead, that without his confession, no one knows where Sarah is. But I also tell her I have not stopped searching. I tell her I drive that highway every few months, and I walk into the forests, and I look. Because this is what they don't tell you about being a journalist covering these cases. They don't tell you that you start carrying the weight of every missing woman, as if she is your own sister. They don't tell you that you memorize their faces, their names, their last steps. They don't tell you that you dream about them, that you think you see them in crowds, your heart stopping before you realize it isn't them. It could never be them because they are gone. I have Evelyn's picture on my desk, her graduation photo, where she is wearing a blue dress and smiling with her whole face. I look at it every day and think about the fact that Highway 43 is not officially part of the Highway of Tears, even though the pattern is exactly the same. The Highway of Tears is Highway 16 in British Columbia, where dozens of Indigenous women have vanished over the past 50 years. Everyone knows Highway 16. There are documentaries about it. There are memorials along the road. But Highway 43 in Alberta, the highway where my cousin died, where 8 women that we know of were murdered, that highway is not famous. That highway does not have a name. Those women are not part of the national conversation. I tried to change that. I wrote articles. I pitched stories to editors at major newspapers. I contacted documentary filmmakers. Most of them said the same thing. They said the Highway of Tears story had already been told. They said readers were suffering from true crime fatigue. They said there was not enough of a hook. I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to tell them that 8 dead women was enough of a hook. I wanted to tell them that just because one highway became famous does not mean we should ignore all the others. But I did not scream. I just kept researching. I just kept collecting data. I just kept trying to find patterns that might prevent the next disappearance. And I found something. I found that between 2010 and 2020, there were at least 43 Indigenous women who disappeared or were murdered along highways in Alberta alone. 43 women. Most of their cases are still unsolved. Most of them received minimal media coverage. Most of them were written off as women who made bad choices, who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, who should have known better than to hitchhike or walk alone at night. Nobody asked why these women were hitchhiking in the first place. Nobody asks why there is no public transportation in rural areas. Nobody asks why these women felt they had no other choice. I stopped working as a journalist last year. I could not do it anymore. I could not keep writing about dead women and watching nothing change. I could not keep interviewing grieving mothers and then watching the cases go cold. I could not keep attending vigils and marches and rallies where we all said never again, and then it happened again anyway. I was drowning in grief and rage and helplessness, and I needed to step back before I lost myself completely. But I still search for Sarah. I still drive Highway 43 every few months. I still walk into those forests hoping that maybe this time I will find something the search teams missed. I owe that to Evelyn. I owe that to Sarah's mother, who still calls me with hope in her voice even though 3 years have passed. I owe that to every woman whose name I have in my files, every woman who disappeared and became just a statistic. Ellis is dead, but the highway is still there. The forests are still there, and somewhere in those trees are the remains of 2 women who deserve to be found, 2 women who deserve to go home, 2 women whose families deserve to bury them properly and say goodbye. I do not know if I will ever find them. I do not know if anyone will. But I have to keep trying because if I stop, if I give up, then Ellis wins. Then those women are forgotten. Then their deaths meant nothing. And I refuse to let that happen. I refuse to let Evelyn's death be just another case and just another file and just another journalist research. She was real, she was loved, she had a future. And she deserves to be remembered as more than just a victim, more than just a body in the woods, more than just one of 8. She deserves to be remembered as Evelyn, as my cousin, as the girl with the contagious laugh who wanted to be a teacher. That is the story I will keep telling. That is the story that matters. My name is Nathan, and I host a true crime podcast called Forgotten Alberta, where I investigate local mysteries and cold cases that have been largely ignored by mainstream media. I started it 3 years ago because I grew up listening to my grandfather tell stories about strange things that happened in rural Alberta, things that nobody ever talked about, things that got pushed aside or buried because small towns do not like trouble or bad publicity. I thought if I could shine a light on some of these cases, maybe I could help bring closure to families who had been waiting decades for answers. I truly thought I was doing something good. I truly believed I was being respectful. I never imagined that some stories do not just sit quietly in the past. Some stories push back when you try to uncover them. In September of 2022, I started researching a case that had fascinated me since I was a teenager. In 1974, a family of 4 was murdered in their farmhouse about 30 km outside of Brooks, Alberta. The victims were a husband and wife in their 30s and their 2 children, a boy aged 9 and a girl aged 6. They were found by a neighbor who had noticed that their cattle had not been fed for several days. The scene was brutal. All 4 family members had been stabbed many times. There were signs of a fight. The house had been torn apart like someone was searching for something important, but nothing valuable was missing. No money, no jewelry, nothing. The RCMP investigated for months but never found a suspect. There were no witnesses. The farmhouse was isolated. The nearest neighbor almost 2 km away. The family kept to themselves. They did not have known enemies. The case went cold within a year and stayed unsolved for almost 50 years. The farmhouse was abandoned soon after the murders. Nobody wanted to live where an entire family had been killed. Over the decades, the place fell apart. The second floor collapsed. The porch rotted. The windows shattered. Nature slowly started swallowing the house back into the earth. I decided to do a 2-part episode on the case. The first part would cover the known facts and theories. The second part would be more experimental. I wanted to go to the farmhouse myself and record ambient sounds to give listeners a true sense of what the place felt like now, to bring them into the ghost of that house. I know some people think that is disrespectful, that I was using a tragedy for entertainment, but I genuinely believed I was honoring the victims by keeping their story alive. I drove to the farmhouse on a gray afternoon in late September. The property was easy to find. The driveway still existed, though it was buried under weeds. The house itself looked worse than I had imagined. The second floor was caved in. The porch looked like it would break under a feather. The front door was missing. It looked like a place you only see in nightmares. I felt uneasy standing there, but I told myself that was normal. The place had a history soaked into the wood. I set up my equipment in what was once the living room. I had a high-quality recorder, the kind that captures sounds beyond what humans can hear. I placed it on a broken table near the fireplace and let it record for 3 hours while I walked around outside taking photos and notes. By the time I returned, the sun was low. The shadows inside stretched long and strange across the floor. The air felt heavier, like the house itself was breathing slowly around me. But again, I told myself I was imagining things. I took the recorder home. That night, I transferred the audio to my computer. I started listening. For the first hour, it was normal. Wind through broken windows, old wood creaking, tiny animals scurrying. Then around 1 hour and 20 minutes, I heard something faint. I paused and rewound. It sounded like voices, human voices. I isolated and amplified the audio, 2 men, talking quietly like they didn't want anyone to hear. I caught only pieces. One voice said something like deeper than we thought. The other replied, but I could not understand. Then the first voice again, clearer. The baby is still down there. We should have checked. My stomach dropped. I had been alone. No one else had been on the property. The recorder had been inside while I was outside. I told myself it must have been radio interference. Or maybe someone had walked onto the property without me noticing. But the place was too remote. No one casually strolls through an area like that. I listened more. For the next hour, nothing strange happened. Then at 2:33, I heard something that made me yank off my headphones. My own voice, clear, close, saying, "I am already down here, Nathan. I have been waiting." I froze. I was outside the house at that time. I had not said anything like that all day, but it was absolutely my voice. I did not sleep. I kept replaying it, trying to understand. The file was raw, untouched. No trick, no glitch, no explanation. The next morning, shaken, I called the Brooks RCMP and asked to speak about the 1974 murders. They put me through to Corporal Singh. I explained everything, the voices, the mention of the baby. It was quiet on the line for a long time. Then he told me to send the audio. I sent it immediately. He called back later. He said the recording was disturbing and that they were going to investigate. He told me something from the old case files. The murdered family did not have a baby. They had 2 children, yes, but the mother had been 7 months pregnant. The coroner had confirmed that, and yet no fetus had been found. The report mentioned her stomach had been cut open after death and the fetus removed, but the investigators had never found any trace of it. They searched the property back then, including the well, but nothing showed. Now, Singh was going to get permission to excavate the well. 3 days later, he called again. They drained the well. Deep at the bottom, buried in layers of mud, they found small bones. A fetus, 7 months gestation. The baby had been in the well for almost 50 years. The case reopened. For a moment, it felt like a tiny part of something broken finally aligned. But I couldn't stop thinking about that voice in the recording. My voice, the voice that said it was already down there. 2 weeks later, I went back to the farmhouse. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I was pulled there by something older than logic. Maybe I was scared, but curiosity dragged me anyway. I set up the recorder in the same place, but this time I stayed inside, watching, listening, hoping nothing would happen. For 2 hours, nothing did. No voices, no strange sounds, just an empty house dying quietly around me. I felt foolish. I was about to pack up when I noticed floorboards near the fireplace looked newer than the rest. The wood was slightly lighter. I touched them. They were loose. I knew I should have called Singh, but I didn't. I pulled them up. Underneath was a crawl space, barely 2 feet deep. My phone light revealed fabric wrapped around something. I reached down and touched it. The cloth turned to dust. Underneath was a book, a journal, a soaked, yellowing journal. I opened it. The first page said, "Property of Nathan Brooks, my name, my full name." Written in handwriting that looked like mine, exactly like mine, but this journal was old, far older than me. I flipped through the pages. Every page was filled with entries describing the farmhouse, describing the family, describing plans, terrible plans. The last entry was from October 1st, 1974, 2 days before the murders. It said, "Tomorrow I will finish what I started. The baby cannot be allowed to live. The baby knows what I am." I dropped the journal. I felt like the house had tilted around me. I grabbed my equipment and ran until my legs hurt. I took the journal straight to the RCMP. They analyzed it. The paper was from the 1970s. The ink was old. There were no prints except mine. They could not explain the handwriting. They asked if this was a hoax, if I had planted it for content. I told them no. I told them I had no explanation. I told them I was terrified. I never went back to that farmhouse. I stopped recording my podcast. I deleted the audio files, but I still hear them in my head, especially the one with my voice. The one saying I was already down there. I dream now. Dreams where I stand in that farmhouse in 1974, watching the family sleep upstairs, feeling a knife in my hand, feeling something inside me whisper that I have done this before. I wake up gasping and checking my hands for blood. There never is, but the dreams keep coming, and a fear keeps growing inside me. What if some version of me was there that night? What if time bends in ways we do not see? What if I am tangled in something that started before I was even born? I do not know. I do not have answers. I just know some stories should stay buried, some cold cases should stay cold, and some farmhouses should never be disturbed. My name is Zoe and I am a journalist. Or I was a journalist until I covered a story that made me question everything I thought I understood about belief and manipulation, and how quickly devotion can turn into something deadly. In the spring of 2012, I was working for a regional newspaper based in Edmonton, and I got a tip from a source about a group living in a compound near Cold Lake. The source, who worked at a hardware store in town, told me that members of this group had been coming in every few weeks buying supplies. Large quantities of non-perishable food, water purification tablets, batteries, propane tanks. They paid in cash. They did not talk much, but they kept mentioning a date. November 21st, 2012. They kept saying they had to be ready by November 24. And I did some digging. The group called themselves the Ascension Fellowship, and they were led by a man who went by the name of Brother Oscar. I could not find much about him online, just a few old forum posts on doomsday prepper websites where he talked about receiving visions from God about the end of civilization. He believed that on November 21st, 2012, there would be a global catastrophe that would wipe out most of humanity. He said only those who were spiritually pure would survive to build a new world. He had convinced about 40 people to sell everything they owned, leave their families, and join him at a property he had purchased near Cold Lake. They had been there for almost a year by the time I heard about them. I convinced my editor to let me investigate. I said it could be a big story, that this was exactly the kind of thing people were interested in with all the 2012 doomsday predictions that were popular at the time. He gave me a week to see what I could find. I started by trying to contact the group directly. I sent letters to the property address. I called the phone number listed on their rudimentary website. Nobody responded, so I decided to drive up to Cold Lake and try to approach them in person. The compound was about 15 km outside of town on a remote piece of land surrounded by forest. There was a gate at the entrance with a sign that said, "Private property, Ascension Fellowship, no trespassing." The gate was locked. I parked my car and walked up to it. There was an intercom system attached to the gate post. I pressed the button. After a long moment, a woman's voice answered. I explained that I was a journalist and that I wanted to write a story about their community. The voice said, "No media, no outsiders, please leave." I tried to explain that I just wanted to understand their beliefs, that I would be respectful. The voice repeated, "Please leave." Then the intercom went completely silent. I stood there for a while, taking pictures of the gate, the fence, and the quiet trees behind it. I could see a few buildings in the distance, 3 or 4 shapes standing still. Then I heard a vehicle coming from inside the compound. A pickup truck rolled up to the gate and a man stepped out. He looked like he was in his 50s, thin, with long gray hair tied back in a loose ponytail. He looked exhausted. More than that, he looked scared. He came closer to the gate and asked what I wanted. I explained who I was. I told him I wanted to tell their story. He glanced back at the buildings behind him and said softly, "We're not supposed to talk to outsiders." He said Brother Oscar claimed the outside world was dirty and full of lies, but he needed me to understand something. His daughter was inside. Her name was Claire. She was 19. He came here because she had joined this group, and he couldn't let her be here alone. But now he realized he had made a terrible mistake. This place wasn't what he believed. Oscar wasn't a prophet. He was sick, and he was planning something terrible for November 21st. I took out my notebook and began writing everything down. The man told me his name was Dylan. He said that as the date approached, Oscar had been acting stranger and stranger. He talked about strange visions, spirits, signs from beyond. And he said that God had told him that the ascension wouldn't happen naturally, that the faithful needed to help it happen. Oscar had started preparing something he called an ascension ceremony for November 21st. He had been collecting all kinds of medications, sleeping pills, sedatives. He kept saying that the body was a cage and that they needed to break free from it to reach the higher realm. Dylan realized Oscar was talking about a mass suicide disguised as a holy event. I asked Dylan why he didn't leave, why he didn't take his daughter and go straight to the police. He said Claire didn't believe him anymore. She believed Oscar completely. She told him he was weak, that he had no faith. And Oscar had taken everyone's IDs and car keys when they joined. He said it would keep them from returning to the corrupted world. Dylan said he had been trying to plan how to get Claire out, but she refused to leave. And there were many others, especially younger ones, who trusted Oscar with everything. They would follow him anywhere. I told Dylan I would call the police right away, but he grabbed my arm through the gate and whispered, "No, not yet." He said if the police showed up too soon, Oscar would speed up his plan. Oscar had already told the group that being threatened by outsiders meant it was time to ascend. Dylan begged me to wait just one more week so he could try to convince Claire to leave. If he couldn't save her by November 20th, then I should call the police. I didn't want to wait. Everything inside me said these people were in danger, but I also knew this was his child, so I agreed. I gave him my number and told him to call me if anything changed. Over the next week, I dug into Oscar's past. His real name was Oscar Beaumont. He had been involved in strange religious movements since the 1980s. He had been kicked out of churches for preaching dark, end-of-days ideas. In 2009, he was arrested for fraud after tricking elderly people into giving him their life savings for a doomsday event he claimed would happen in 2010. When nothing happened, he simply moved the date, found new followers, and started over. On November 19th, 2 days before the planned ascension, Dylan called me. His voice was barely a whisper. He said Oscar had moved the ceremony to November 20th, the very next night. Oscar told the group it was time. Dylan said he had tried one last time to convince Claire to run away with him, and she reported him to Oscar for doubting the ascension. Oscar locked him inside a storage building as punishment. Dylan had found a phone another member had hidden. He said, "Please, you have to call the police now. They're going to do it tomorrow night." I immediately called the Cold Lake RCMP and told them everything. They said officers were already on the way to the compound. I asked if I could go with them. They told me absolutely not, that this was now a police operation. I went back to my hotel and waited. I couldn't sleep. All I could think about was Claire and the others, all believing they were doing something holy by dying. The police raided the compound around 8 p.m. on November 20th. I later learned what they found. Most of the group, 23 people, were lying on the floor of the main building, unconscious. They had drank fruit juice mixed with sedatives and painkillers. 4 of them were already dead, including brother Oscar. He had taken a stronger dose than everyone else. Paramedics rushed in and tried to save them. Many survived. Dylan was found locked inside the storage building. He was physically okay, but completely hysterical. Claire was one of the unconscious survivors. She was alive. In the days after the raid, I met several survivors in the hospital. Most were confused. Some were angry they had been saved. They said they had been ready to ascend. They said the police had ruined everything. One woman said Oscar had promised they would wake up in paradise and that their suffering would be gone forever. She said she had been looking forward to that moment. She even told me she wished the police had arrived an hour later because by then it would have been too late to save her. Claire survived, but she never spoke to her father again. She refused to see him in the hospital. She said he destroyed her chance at salvation. Dylan told me that she eventually moved away and changed her name. He tried reaching out to her, but she never answered. He said he saved her life, yet she hated him for it. The 4 who died were ruled suicides. None of the survivors were charged. The group fell apart. The land was sold. I wrote several articles about the Ascension Fellowship, and they spread quickly across the country. I even won an award for journalism, but I kept thinking about what one woman told me in the hospital. She stared right into my eyes and said, "You don't understand. We weren't scared. No one forced us. We wanted this. We believed, and you took it from us." That's the strange thing about belief. When it gets strong enough, it stops feeling like belief and starts feeling like truth. These people weren't insane. They weren't stupid. They were just searching for purpose, for something bigger than their lonely lives. And Oscar gave it to them. He gave them a clear path in a confusing world, a community that accepted them, a story that made them feel important. And when he told them it was time to die for that story, most of them didn't hesitate. 6 months later, I left journalism. I couldn't keep writing about disasters as if they were just stories, because they weren't. They were people making choices I couldn't understand. And I started asking myself what I believed, what I would be willing to die for, and whether anything I believed was actually real. Sometimes I drive past the place where the compound once stood. The buildings are gone now, just empty land, but I think about those 23 people lying on the floor, waiting for their moment to ascend. I think about Brother Oscar, who swallowed his last breath, believing he would wake up somewhere better. I think about Claire, who will never forgive her father for saving her life. And I think about belief, how it can be the most beautiful thing in the world or the most dangerous, and how it's almost impossible to know the difference until it's too late. My name is Patrick, and I have been flipping houses for almost 15 years. I started in Calgary, but in 2015 I moved to Medicine Hat because the property prices were better and there was less competition. My business model is simple. I buy foreclosed or run down houses at auction, fix them up, and sell them for a profit. Most of the time it is straightforward work. Replace old floors, paint the walls, update the kitchen and bathroom, maybe fix some structural issues. I have seen houses in terrible shape, houses full of garbage, filth, and abandonment, houses where people clearly left in a rush, leaving everything behind like they were fleeing from something. But nothing prepared me for what I found in the basement of 427 Kingsway Avenue in September 2017. The property came up at a foreclosure auction. It was a small 1960s bungalow. Nothing special. The previous owner, a man named Harper, had been arrested for fraud and embezzlement. He ran some shady investment scheme, lost everything when it collapsed, and the bank seized his home. I won the bid for $60,000, a good deal even for Medicine Hat. The house needed work, but the structure was solid. I figured I could flip it in 3 months and make decent money. Renovations started in early September. The main floor was nothing unusual: dated wallpaper, old carpet, a kitchen stuck in the 1980s standard stuff. I spent a week gutting the main floor, hauling debris to the dump. Then I moved to the basement. It was unfinished. Concrete walls and floor, exposed ceiling beams, an old furnace in the corner. There was a washer, dryer hookup, and a tiny bathroom. I measured the space to see if I could finish it and add a bedroom, and that's when I noticed something strange. The basement felt smaller than it should. I measured upstairs, then downstairs. There was about an 8-foot difference along the east wall. I tapped the concrete, hollow. I looked closer and saw a thin vertical line in the wall, almost invisible, like it had been cut and patched. I grabbed a sledgehammer and started breaking through. Behind it was a room, maybe 8 by 10 feet, all concrete, no windows, a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center was a metal chair bolted to the floor, leather restraints attached to the arms and legs with heavy buckles. On the walls, pinned with thumbtacks, were photographs, dozens of them, Polaroids, all showing the same horrifying thing: women tied to that chair, faces twisted in fear, pain, or exhaustion. Different women, 6 I could count. The photos were numbered sequentially. I felt sick. I dropped the sledgehammer and stepped back. My hands shook. I pulled out my phone and called the police. I told them what I had found. They said not to touch anything and that officers were on the way. I went outside and waited on the front porch. I couldn't stay in that house. I couldn't be near that room. The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 officers first, then more, then detectives and a forensic team. They spent hours photographing, collecting the Polaroids, and taking samples. A detective, Corporal Martinez, spoke to me about Harper. I told him I only knew he had been arrested for fraud. Martinez said they would need to identify the women in the photos. It took 3 days. 4 were matched to missing persons reports between 2008 and 2014, all Indigenous women between 20 and 35, from Medicine Hat or nearby towns. All were eventually found alive, dumped somewhere in the city, but none reported abduction. Their cases were closed once they returned. A week later, Martinez called me to the station. In an interview room, he showed files on the 4 women. At first, they denied knowing anything, but when shown the photos, they broke down. They admitted Harper had abducted them. He would pick them up at night, knock them out with drugs, and wake them tied to that chair, blindfolded in that same room. He never spoke to them, just came in, clicked a camera, left. He held them for days, then drugged them again and released them somewhere in the city. I asked why they never went to the police. Martinez said shame, disbelief, fear. They were women who had been ignored by the system, afraid no one would believe them, afraid of Harper returning. So they stayed silent, tried to forget, tried to live their lives. The remaining 2 women in the photos had not been identified. Martinez said they might never be found, or they might never have been reported missing. Harper was arrested in prison and charged with 4 counts of kidnapping and forcible confinement. His trial was in 2018. All 4 identified victims testified, describing the room, the chair, the blindfold, the silence. Harper sat emotionless the entire time. His lawyer argued the evidence was circumstantial, but the jury didn't care. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 18 years. During sentencing, the judge asked Harper if he wanted to speak. He stared at the 4 women in the gallery and said, "I could have killed you. I could have done worse, but I let you go. You should be grateful." One woman cried, another screamed. The judge told Harper to sit. But he kept going. "You want to know why I let you go? I was not ready. I was practicing. I was learning. I wanted to see how long someone could be kept, how long I could make them forget, and it worked. For years it worked. None of you said anything. None of you did anything. You just went back to your lives. So who really has the power here?" The judge had him removed for contempt, but his words stayed with me. The thought that he was practicing, that he wasn't finished, that if I hadn't found that room, he might still be out there, maybe next time not letting anyone go. I sold the house eventually, disclosing the history, which tanked its value. The new owners tore down the basement and sealed it with concrete. But I still think about it. Those 2 women never identified. Are they alive somewhere, or did something worse happen? Are there other rooms like that hidden in plain sight? 4 women had to relive their trauma in court just to get a conviction. They were told by the man who abducted them to be grateful he let them live. The courage it takes to finally speak after years of silence, facing the person who terrorized you, knowing judgment will follow. The system failed them before. If someone had believed that the first time, maybe Harper would have been caught earlier. Maybe the other 2 women would have been found. I don't flip houses in Medicine Hat anymore. I moved back to Calgary, but every time I break through a wall or open a locked door, I hesitate. I brace myself for what I might find because now I know houses hold secrets, and sometimes those secrets are far worse than anything you imagine. My name is Adam, and I never believed in the supernatural until winter 2021. When I learned Alberta's lonely highways hide things some people should never see. I tell this story because it has lived inside me for years, shaping every thought when I see a stretch of frozen road with no headlights in sight. I tell it because some missing person cases are not over, and sometimes they make no sense to the living. It started on a bitterly cold night in early December. I had driven the Calgary, Edmonton corridor countless times, sometimes for work, sometimes to see family. That night, I was alone, exhausted after too many hours awake. The steady rumble of the tires and my own nervous energy were all that kept me awake. Snow had been falling for hours, covering the road, hiding tail lights 1 pair at a time, traffic thinned by red deer, gas stations glowed like distant lanterns. I stopped at one to stretch and fill the tank. The place felt deserted, protected from the wind, lit by buzzing fluorescent lights, smelling of burnt coffee. Outside, I noticed someone under the awning brushing snow from her hood, eyes downcast. I almost passed, but she looked up and smiled, headed north. She asked softly, though I knew not to pick up hitchhikers, something about her made me pause. No luggage, just a small satchel, frost clinging to her boots. She didn't seem desperate, just tired. I nodded and unlocked the passenger door. "Going to Edmonton," I said. She got in quietly, buckling her seatbelt like someone chilled to the bone. We didn't talk much at first. She said her name was Penelope, heading home after a long time away. Her voice was strange, soft, almost melodic, polite in a way that seemed out of place. I kept glancing at her, wondering why she was so calm, alone on such a night. She asked unusual questions about family, loss, and closure. Her eyes stayed on the snow, watching it swirl against the glass. "You drive a lot," she said. "More than enough," I replied. "I know this road too well." Conversation drifted into silence. Just past Panoa, as the road curved along the edge of the forest, Penelope spoke again. "Do you ever get the feeling that something is following you, chasing you after years, and if you stop for even a second, it will catch you, and everything you know will change?" I laughed nervously, half to hide my fear, half to push away the tension building in my chest. She didn't smile. "Some things are not meant to be found," she said softly, pressing her fingers against the frosted window. We drove on in silence, but I could not shake a sense of heaviness. A little after midnight, I stopped at another gas station for coffee. Penelope stayed inside the car while I went in. The place was plastered with lost dog flyers and missing person posters, faces staring from faded paper, some decades old. As I scanned the wall, my eyes caught one photo and froze. A young woman, dark-haired, serious expression, faded blue coat. The caption read, "Missing Penelope R. Last seen November 2003, Red Deer, Alberta, age 22, family still searching." My mind spun. The photo was identical to the woman sitting in my car, yet the poster was nearly 20 years old. I bought my coffee with trembling hands, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Back in the car, Penelope was awake, staring straight ahead. The dim glow of headlights illuminated her face, making her features strange and unreal. I wanted to speak, but the silence of the passenger seat froze me. Just north of Luke, snow began falling harder, swallowing the road, pressing in around us. Suddenly, Penelope turned and looked at me. "Thank you for picking me up," she said gently. "I did not want to be alone tonight. I do not like the dark anymore. I used to feel safe out here, but now I know what the dark is." A chill ran down my spine. "You live in Edmonton?" I asked, voice shaky. She gave a faint, almost sad smile. "I used to. We neared the city." Penelope closed her eyes and rested her head against the window. The forest slipped by, dark and silent. I glanced over. Her seatbelt was still fastened, her breathing shallow. I felt a strange protectiveness, as if her fragile presence demanded I keep her safe until morning. Just as we reached the city limits, flashing police lights lit up the highway. A cruiser sat at the intersection where I planned to turn. I stopped cautiously, watching officers sweep the woods with flashlights. Penelope looked at them. "Sometimes people are looking for something they will never find," she whispered. I drove on, finally daring to ask, "Does your family know where you are?" She looked at me, eyes clear, aching with sadness. "I think they hope I am still out there, waiting for a way to get home." Before I could say more, she began humming a melody, soft and familiar, one my mother had sung when I was a child. The sound was intimate, impossible, coming from a stranger. I gripped the wheel tighter. When I reached the quiet suburban street near the university where she wanted to get out, she stepped out calmly, thanked me, and walked into the shadows between two snowbanks. I watched, waiting to see if she would head toward a house or vanish entirely. Just as I lost sight of her, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Thank you for taking me home. Please drive carefully." I blinked, confused, and tried to call back. Disconnected. I looked at the seat. Her seatbelt still fastened. A faint patch of breath on the window, but no footprints in the snow. Nothing suggested she had opened the door. Haunted, I called the number on the old missing person poster. An older woman answered, her voice kind, worn by years of searching. "Hello, you have reached Penelope's mother," she said. I stammered, trying to explain. I had just given a young woman a ride from Red Deer to Edmonton, who looked exactly like the photograph on your poster. Apologies if it was someone who resembled her. Silence hung on the line. "Penelope disappeared in November 2003, her mother said softly. "We have never stopped hoping, but every year, around this time, someone calls saying they saw her, gave her a ride, spoke to her. It started after the first anniversary. My husband once got a letter with no return address saying, "I am safe." Thank you, words only she would use. What do you think is happening? I asked. The mother hesitated. People say there are places in Alberta where the past does not stay buried, where lost things drift through the snow, looking for someone to bring them home. I do not know if you saw my daughter. I do not know if anyone ever does. But thank you for calling. Thank you for not letting her story be forgotten. After that night, I became obsessed with Penelope's case. Hours were spent reading everything: online witness statements, family interviews, small news articles, local papers repeating the same hopeless story. A bright young woman gone without a trace, last seen waiting for a bus after work. Across every account, the same thread appeared: a cold night, a brief moment, a conversation with a stranger who might tell the story. Many said she looked peaceful. Many said she spoke almost nothing. Details always matched: the age, the coat, the song. I joined forums for missing persons, contacting anyone who had seen Penelope in dreams or life. Some accounts were years old, some from last winter, but all hinted at the same truth. Penelope never returned in any normal way. Yet her presence haunted the highways between Red Deer and Edmonton. I even found dashcam footage posted anonymously, showing a young woman walking along the snowy shoulder at night, vanishing as a car passed. Some commenters noted the location matched her last known spot in 2003. My own dashcam showed nothing, just snow, silence, and an empty passenger seat. Yet when I replay the footage, sometimes I hear faint humming beneath the wind and static. Since then, every year, I receive a letter with no return address. Handwriting matches the old missing person poster. Same 3 sentences inside. Thank you for taking me home. Please remember me. Drive safely in the snow. I keep each letter in a box next to the photograph from her missing poster. Every glance brings dread and relief, a secret alive through memory, repetition, and the kindness of strangers who refuse to forget. I do not know what happened to Penelope. I do not know if the woman I picked up was a ghost, a hopeful illusion of unresolved grief, or something stranger, a lost soul waiting for a ride in the dark Alberta winter. Since that night, I have pulled over countless times on empty highways, searching for faces that do not belong, hoping for closure that never comes. What I am certain of is this: Alberta's highways keep their mysteries, and for some, the journey home is never really over. Whether it ends with headlights reaching through the snow or a stranger's voice breaking the silence is not always up to the living. And sometimes the greatest kindness you can offer is to remember, to drive on, and never to let the story vanish completely into the light.